And here comes Michelle. Okay, so let's get started. Time. So last May, I had the honor of spending 3 weeks with Brooklyn and 20 other participants in Palestine and Israel on the Yella Learning Tour. Yella means let's go, and it's a joint Mennonite Church Eastern Canada and MCC learning tour to Israel and Palestine for young adults. So some might find themselves hesitant to visit this land as news of all the conflict and suffering comes out of the region regularly. But we hear from our partners in Israel and Palestine that it is important now more than ever for visitors, especially young people, to make a trip to learn the roots of the conflict. So Brooklyn, who's going to be presenting today, Brooklyn Lester, a lot of us are well acquainted with our Brooklyn. She's in her 4th year of International Development Studies at the University of Waterloo. She has been studying the Palestinian crisis throughout her undergrad and is currently completing her honors thesis on trauma coping and resilience building in Palestine children in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Brooklyn will reflect on the experiences and the learnings of her and her fellow Yella participants last May. With no further ado, I turn it over to Brooklyn.
So as Cheryl mentioned, I had the opportunity to travel to Israel, Palestine. And I'm going to be frank, it was the most heartbreaking, horrific experience I've ever had. But I think there's a lot of really valuable lessons that we learned. I just want to share kind of my observations and kind of how do we really understand exactly what's happening and what's stemming from what. So I'm not going to bore you guys with too much of the context. I know at least many of you are somewhat aware of what's going on, but just to give you like a very brief overview, basically the green area here in 1946 was Palestinian territory under both international law and was occupied by Palestinians. And then now as we move forward to 2010, those green areas are areas within the West Bank and Gaza Strip that are not occupied by settlers. So basically, they're confined to very, very small spaces, mostly in refugee camps with absolutely no human rights under occupation. And Gaza is a bit of a different situation, but it's considered the largest prison in the world and will be unlivable by 2020, according to the United Nations. So that is kind of the current context. So there's this book called The Spiral of Violence by Don Helder Camara. And so he's a Catholic archbishop from South America, and he kind of talks about the spiral of violence. And he's trying to understand, when we see violence all over the world, where is this stemming from and all that. So basically, this is how I chose to understand the Palestinian conflict, and I've been working with Derek Suderman, who is one of the leaders on the trip, to kind of go through and understand this. So this is kind of the lens I'm going to be exploring this through with you guys today. And he outlines 3 types of violence. So there's institutional violence, there's counter-violence, and then there's repressive violence. So these are all types of violence that we witnessed during our trip and connect to each other a lot more than I think I realized in the moment, but only with further reflection afterwards. You realize just how intertwined all these situations are. So the first type, institutional violence, is basically the idea that this is any institutional condition, action, policy that seeks to emotionally or physically dominate, diminish, dehumanize others. So this can be neglect, this can be attack. So during the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a comment was made that the violence of bombs can cripple bodies, but the violence of miseducation can cripple minds. And this is exactly what we're seeing here. Any type of medical or educational initiatives are being shot down and restricted by the Israeli military. You know, we visited several United Nations schools that had been bombed, so these children no longer have access to education necessarily. And so basically, the entire occupation was built on this institutional violence that is seeking to diminish and dehumanize. The first kind of, and I would say this was the most, for me, personal example where I saw just the extent of the violence was in Hebron. So we went to the old city of Hebron, and this is one of the most contentious sites of the entire conflict. It is home to the tomb of the patriarchs, tomb of the matriarchs, and this is generally where the most religious settlers reside. So there are basically three types of settlers, basically just meaning Israeli citizens who, against international law, are choosing to reside and build homes in Palestinian territory under international law. So there's economic settlers. So this is basically just the government gives them enough economic incentive to live there. There are political settlers who are just trying to further the state of Israel, and then there are the religious settlers, which is entirely removed from politics and based very strongly off of historical, basically the history of the region. So in Hebron, this is just the case. When we saw, you know, the people walking around with long skirts, the pathways are segregated. So you see, that's our tour guide, who's on the other side of this fence with barbed wire at the top, and we're walking separately because he's not allowed to walk in the same pathways. The entire city is completely segregated. And then you even see, on the far right there, sorry, the glare, I missed it. You can't really tell, but along the shops, there's chicken wire and tin sheets because settlers live in the apartments above, and they'll throw urine, feces, objects, garbage down as both adults and children are walking by. So that's kind of the state of Hebron. And I think for me, the most stark example of institutional violence. And I don't know if you guys have heard of the Stanford prison experiments, pretty famous. So shut down after 6 days because the experimenter, he found that the moral and ethical violations of a simulated prison turn these young men from the good Dr. Jekyll to the evil Mr. Hyde. And our tour guide reflected on this checkpoints within Hebron. The soldiers are rotated every 3 months because the Israeli military does not want these young conscripted men, 18, 19, to fall victim to humanizing them, to saying, wow, I've seen this man every day for 6 months. He's not violent, he's just trying to live his life. So they're creating these institutional conditions to continue this dehumanization. And Sahar Vardi, I think a lot of you have probably maybe heard from her at one point, so I'll just touch on this briefly, but she just talked about how there's this narrative in Israel, how at one point we're always persecuted, God always rescues us. And this is the basis for Israel. We need Israel because we're always going to be persecuted against. And she's saying they use this fear to create this militarized society. And there's all these positive and normalizing references in the curriculum, kindergarten education, just to create in these children this idea that this is Israel, this is necessary, this is for our survival. So even more stark than that, though, I found even her reflections on being a woman in the Israeli military. She was a I don't know if she would say conscientious objector or some type of objector. So she served jail time for not serving in the military, but she was saying this masculinized society that we see in the military, we see it in our military, we see it all around the world. There's lots of violence against women, and that's not really a concern in a society that's growing increasingly militarized. There's a lot of class-based differences, so young soldiers who can't afford to be away from their families. It just creates a lot of problems within Israeli society. So they've got these institutional conditions to kind of punish Palestinians, and yet there's a lot of unforeseen complications and violence against Israeli citizens as well. So that's kind of the gist of some of those. And then just again, the West Bank is this occupied territory, no access to food, clean water all the time necessarily, and it's growing increasingly dire. So that's basically some of my initial reflections on the institutional conditions that are now resulting in what he calls violence number 2, which is counter-violence. So during our time, we went to Oranim College in Haifa, which is outside of the West Bank, and we heard from Mr. Shaha, who had this young daughter, Beit Shean, and she was murdered by a suicide bomber on her 15th birthday during the Second Intifada. And so this suicide bomber was a young Palestinian man, and he kind of talked about how do you respond to this? Do I go re-enlist in the military and shoot up a bunch of Palestinian children? And he decided he couldn't do that because he saw this violence against Palestinians and this response that took the life of his beautiful young daughter. So they started this peace initiative where they're working to create conversation between Palestinians and Israelis. So that was a really beautiful story, but I just want to read you one of her poems, kind of reflecting on her life and growing up in these times of conflict and war, and just what exactly that was like for her. So this poem is called The Gas Mask. That no one predicted the war, then it came, the siren like a loud roar. And into the sealed room we ran. Since this was the first time for the task, I had an argument with the gas mask. I said, not only do you make me sick and press on my throat, but you won't let me sleep. What are you thinking, you insolent thing? The gas mask kept quiet, but suddenly let out a sigh. You hurt me and started to cry. You should know that I'm only protecting you, keeping you from harm. Sorry, I said, but it still presses on me and makes me nauseous. In my opinion, the mask said, you'll get used to the situation. And remember that as long as I'm covering your head, it's for your own good. I have an idea. Why don't we play checkers? Gladly, the mask said. The two of us then sat and played, forgetting the mask. So went my first day with the mask. In the beginning, I had a bit of a problem, but then I got used to it. I even played with it and won. So once again, this counter-violence of this occupation is just reflected in this young girl who, had to live wearing a gas mask and eventually lost her life from this violence. So an example of this counter-violence as well that we witnessed when we were specifically in Bethlehem, and I just want to go on a tangent for a moment. I don't think I fully explained this counter-violence. It can be violent, and action and strikes, but it also can be nonviolent. So this is also nonviolent resistance. It's any type of civil disobedience challenging these institutional conditions. So when we were in Bethlehem, our first day there was the day that there were these mass shootings in the Gaza Strip. So I think 56 Gaza citizens were killed, many more maimed, injured. And so we were there, and there was great upset. And our host families, you could tell they're watching the news. It just was a really horrific day, a lot of upheaval. But then the next day was our day in Bethlehem. And so we were supposed to, we went to the Church of the Nazarene, where Jesus was so-called born. And, you can decide on your religious, I don't know how to say it. Basically, this is where they think he was born, but everything in Israel is like, this is probably where, but it could be here, 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 or here. So anyway, I also got body checked by a nun down there. So then the rest of the day, we were walking around Bethlehem. We were going to do some shopping, just get to know the area, but it was completely on strike. Everything was closed in response. So this was basically their only way of reacting non-violently to what was going on in Gaza. So they're saying, we're shutting down, our economy's shutting down for the day, we're standing in solidarity with Gaza. So basically we found one little bakery that was open for lunch, and that was the day. We walked around for a couple hours in a completely deserted town of Bethlehem. But again, this is exactly what this counter-response, counter-violence, nonviolent resistance is, and we got to witness that. So that was interesting. Again, it puts into perspective when you hear now about repressive violence. So this is the third type of violence, and this is response to violence number 2, but it takes basically form with police or military, more prison sentences, tougher prison sentences, torture, censorship, basically all of which we either heard about or witnessed in Israel. So Ida refugee camp we spent the day there, and this was created by the United Nations in 1950, and basically 27 Palestinian villages, when they fled the massacres with the creation of Israel, they resided here, and they've been here ever since. So basically, they carry these keys around, and when you enter the camp, there's this large replica of the key over the entrance, and that symbolizes their right to return. So people are still hoping that someday, in some way, they might be able to return to their homes, despite the fact that the majority of them have been destroyed. We saw this, not rebuilt on anything, just destroyed for the sake of destruction. So in this camp, it's not unusual to go 3 weeks without access to fresh water, electricity cuts. It's one of the most densely populated places on the planet, and it's also the most tear-gassed place on the planet, this refugee camp. So from the rooftop, we looked over the Lahi Center, which is an organization working in this refugee camp. This is their playground. So they used to have fields all around where the kids could play, but due to security threats and the apartheid wall, as many people call it, they're not allowed in that area anymore, so they're condensed to this very small area. So this is their playground. And yet you see, okay, it looks fairly normal, and then we watch documentary footage of this playground and children in it being skunk sprayed, tear gassed, shot with rubber bullets. So, and then this basically justification is, well, these kids threw a stone at this soldier, so we're gonna come skunk spray your playground. So this is a very, very common occurrence. There's this documentary called We Have a Dream to Live Safe. I would highly recommend watching. It's pretty horrific, so I don't want to show it to you, but just a warning. But it shows the reality of these young children. It's narrated by this 6-year-old girl who's saying, this is my life. All I want is to be able to live safe and play at the playground and have an education. So, yeah. And then the last example I'm going to give you guys about this violence, and specifically retributive violence, is Military Court Watch. So this is an organization we met with there, and they're working within children in Palestine within the first 24 hours of their arrest. And this is very important because these are basically the most vulnerable hours and the only chance you really have anything to do to help these children. So for context, children range between 6 and 15. After that, they're adults with adult prison sentences. And children are frequently arrested. We met with we walked into one refugee camp, and we met about 4 young boys, and I think 3 out of 4 of them had been arrested for throwing stones, posting on Facebook, censorship, stuff like that. And so basically, there was really military. One of their strategies, and you can read about this a lot in this organization called Breaking the Silence, specifically talking about this, but one of their tactics is night raids. So they go into refugee camps or homes or villages, and they come in the night to arrest children. There's a few reasons for this. First of all, it really limits the civil disobedience because everybody's asleep. Nobody knows this is happening. It really disorients the children. It helps them coax a confession. These children are bags put over their head. They don't know where they're being taken. And they know that confessing to whether it's throwing a stone or something they did or didn't do, confessing is their best way out of the system. They can wait for months if they decide to actually go to court versus when they confess, they can be hopefully out of the system within 3 to 6 months. Could be a few years if it's a repeat crime. So you throw a stone at a soldier the second time, could be a couple years in prison. So the court proceedings, though, is really interesting because, first of all, they're entirely in Hebrew, which young Palestinians, especially young Palestinians, don't speak Hebrew. So it's a different language. They're not allowed representation. Their parents aren't told where they're taken often. So it can take parents days to weeks, quicker if they have the help of Military Court Watch, but just even to track down where their children have been taken. So again, this is more prison sentence, tougher prison sentences. So the more these children rebel, and by rebel, throw stones, swear, really the only form of action they have against the military occupation. The more they do that, the more they're arrested, imprisoned, kind of striking from a young age to subdue any type of civil disobedience. So those are and this is a picture of a young Palestinian boy being arrested. So one of the main, so I did this presentation at the peace conference, and some feedback I got is, okay, well, you're giving this horrific information, like, what do we do with this? Where do we go from here? And I'm trying to figure that out. Cheryl's been great in helping me figure that out, giving me opportunities to speak and share. But yeah, where do we go from here? So one of the most difficult things about having these conversations, I find, in North America is this idea of the Holocaust industry. So Norman Finkelstein is a Jewish academic, and he writes this book called The Holocaust Industry, and it's his reflections on the exploitation of Jewish suffering. So both his parents survived concentration camps, his entire extended family killed in Nazi Germany. And he talks about, okay, so where do we get this idea that it's the survivors of the Holocaust that want to build a nation based off of these horrific crimes against Palestinians? And he's saying the emergence of a lot of Holocaust sympathy comes with this American Zionist movement. So I could go on and on about this forever, but basically the main point is that we live in a society that is very, our narrative is that Israel is our safety against a Middle East coalition. It is our religious duty to protect and preserve Israel. It is politically, we are aligned with Israel. There's so many things, but I really encourage you to think critically about that. Read The Holocaust Industry if you have time, because there's some really kind of disturbing alliances between the creation of Israel and America. So I would read more about that, but it makes it difficult to have conversations, but I encourage you, don't be afraid of upsetting people. I've upset many people. Try to do so in a kind way. But yeah, don't be silenced by our own narratives that you think maybe can't be competed. And, we look at the Holocaust or the South African apartheid, and we see the entire timeline. And we look back. I remember being in grade 10 history and being like, why in the world did nobody do anything about the Holocaust? And I think surely I would have done something. Surely we would do something now. And yet there's so many similarities that I think people don't fully grasp. And we see the full timeline of these other horrific crimes, yet Palestine is still in the process. It is both difficult because it seems like there's no solution, and yet there is still time for meaningful change. As opposed to other courses of history, such as the Holocaust, where everybody says, if only, if only, if only. And so, yeah, I just would say that continue to educate yourself, continue to educate others. And, when people challenge you, one of my favorite quotes by Norman Finkelstein is that, do not compare is the mantra of the moral blackmailer. So don't be afraid to stand up when people refuse to equate kind of our horrors of the past with the horrors of the present, and really think critically about your own perspectives. So thank you, and lots of time for questions, I hope. A few minutes.
Anybody have any questions for Brooklyn?
So, you talked a little bit right at the beginning about trauma, and these young kids are being incarcerated at an early age. That has a direct influence on their attachment to their parents, and then that's just going to, is there any conversation at any levels of both Palestinian and Israelis that the damage to the children is just going to perpetuate the violence? Do they see that it's just it's going to create a never-ending cycle But are there any voices, I guess I'm curious about, for better treatment of children?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I can't think of anything specific. And that's actually what I'm working with my thesis advisor on exploring right now with my thesis is interventions for these children. Because unfortunately, I'll give you an example of the type, kind of, not about children, but about, I guess, the priorities in this conflict. We did these homestays with these Palestinian families, and the one girl, Hind, who was in my homestay, she was talking about dating and their culture and just the horrific way that women were being treated, no rights, just very, very patriarchal. And to a point where, like, our idea of patriarchy holds nothing compared to what's happening in Palestine. But she said nobody can even bring themselves to care about it because they're fighting to survive. They're fighting for food. They're fighting for water. And so, unfortunately, the priorities of freedoms and rights and happy and productive, resilient lives they're just not a priority. And I think there are definitely organizations working with children. There's WeAm, who Tariq spoke about, and there are organizations working to try and aid children in coping and trauma building. But I think, unfortunately, there's not a huge acknowledgement. And we see it in Canada with residential schools, the impact of children and just even inability to parent children because of that removal from their own parents. So I think there's definitely going to be multi-generational effects, and I think there's definitely a gap in the literature and global conversation about that. But I could be wrong, so I'm trying to kind of explore that more.
If I can just add one thing. So one of the things that that Tariq said to us was there's no PTSD in Palestine because they're not post. So they're still in the middle of it.
Yeah.
So they don't talk about PTSD. They're just talking about current and ongoing trauma. Any other questions?
Thanks, Cheryl. Brooklyn, I understood that when you did your presentation at the Peace Conference, you got some pushback. I'm just curious what were, just kind of generalizing the nature of the comments that were pushing back against what you're presenting.
Yeah. So I think the first thing, I showed a video by Jewish Voices for Peace where they refer to Palestinians as the indigenous residents of the area. And again, terminology, personally, yeah, I believe they're the indigenous peoples of that land. You might disagree. I don't think that's the important thing. But a particular audience member had a problem with that. And kind of the root of a lot of justification of this occupation is looking back to the Old Testament, to the chosen people of Israel, referring to, we heard from a settler, Bob Lang, who is very, very, very radical. The most radical person I talked to, but did so in a very, business way. He didn't let on that he was radical. He thought he was very normal. He was an American who moved to Israel because they're like, oh, build a house for free. But basically, so he referred to, when he showed us a map of, Palestine, he referred to Judea and Samaria and all these Old Testament names for the land. And so I think people have a problem with that. They're like, well, the Bible says this. They kind of forego everything that happened between the Old Testament and 2010. And then I think another thing, too, is people kind of people doubted not only my credibility of this particular person, as what do I know, but also, well, if you're hearing these dialogue, these conversations from Palestinians, they're probably making it up, they're Arabs, that's honestly a lot of the narrative. And so, I say, okay, well, there's lots of organizations from both sides, but people just, if they have, they're siding with Israel, they're not willing to understand that the Palestinians, they're not willing to hear their story because they think it's just, I don't really, it's like if you're a Toronto fan, you're not going to listen to the Montreal side of the story. I don't know. Yeah, so people have a really hard time letting go of their own narratives and realizing that religion, politics, that aside, these are just real people, and these are horrific crimes against humanity, and they can't seem to get to that point where they accept that, unfortunately. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Brooklyn.